After hearing about his father's death, Steve Hodel had to sort through his dad's stuff. His relationship with his dad, George Hodel, was never great. George was a big-shot doctor who left the family when Steve was young. Steve found a small photo album while going through his dad's things. In it were usual family photos and some taken by the famous artist Man Ray. But at the end, there were 2 pictures of a woman who looked like the Black Dahlia, a famous unsolved murder victim. Let's see what else he discovers as he looks through the album. Black Dahlia was the name given to Elizabeth Short after she was killed on January 15, 1947, in a brutal way in Los Angeles. The corpse of her body was cut in half, and the parts were placed in a vacant lot. Steve, who has been a detective with the Los Angeles Police Department for over 23 years, was the one. He started to follow the case after finding some pictures that showed Short's connection with Hodel through some personal matters. The Short homicide was the most notorious unsolved case in the state of California. Steve investigated the case and came across some disturbing links. The fact that Short's body was cut in a way that only someone who has studied medicine in the 1930s would have known indicated that George Hodel might have been the one behind the killing. Besides that, the writing style of the letters claimed to be written by Short's killer was similar to George Hodel's handwriting. For the last 15 years, Steve has been devoting his life to the collection of the evidence that links his father to Short's death. He resides in a small apartment in LA writing his books, a play, and a blog about his discoveries. His first book, Black Dahlia Avenger, the book, The True Story, which turned into a bestseller in 2003, was known for its careful documentation of evidence. Steve's research into the Black Dahlia case has made him both the hero and the villain. Others have described this as a mixture of admiration and obsession. His narrative, however, is gripping. An experienced LA detective who is in the middle of this case and who is also trying to figure out his own father's involvement in the most notorious unsolved murder. Now, Steve is not the first to claim he solved the murder of Elizabeth Short, nor the first to suspect a parent. However, he has amassed a huge amount of evidence, including files of the police department, which had his father as a suspect at that time. People's point of views on Steve differ a lot within the police force. One group of people perceive Holmes as a genius detective, but others find him obsessed. However, nobody has yet to prove his findings wrong, thus giving Steve more motivation to continue his research. The media was to a great extent responsible for Short's murder to fame. The Los Angeles Record, a newspaper that covered the case in detail, had their sales boosted as a result. The blood-curdling character of Short's murder also created the mystery, with facts like the forced ingestion of feces and mutilation that shocked the public. Shortly after her death, her body became a morbid fascination, attracting scores of people year after year. The tabloid press, in contrast, highlighted Short's life with a sensationalized account, painting her as a promiscuous figure, even though she wasn't a prostitute. This misrepresentation was also added to the tragedy, as those who knew Short personally would testify. At the Biltmore, a hotel, Elizabeth Short was last spotted alive before her tragic murder. Reddit is a place where people often discuss this case, trying to uncover the identity of the killer. Many writers have written books on the subject. The story of the serial killer's identity has been the subject of much speculation. One woman, Janice Knowlton, was convinced that her father was the killer and wrote a book about it, but her sister said that it was not true. In the story, there is a man named Hodel who lives in a salmon-colored apartment in Studio City. He has been studying the Black Dahlia case for the last 16 years, and he knows a lot about it. He even calls his dad to ask him about his involvement. He stumbled across old receipts that made him question whether his father was involved. Steve couldn't get the original police files since he is not a cop, and a lot of evidence has been lost. So many people who could provide some information about the case have passed away. Steve did it by collecting anecdotes and experiences from various sources. He also reconstructed the conversations that the cops had with others. Some clues were that of a doctor who lived close to Steve's family. Steve met a policewoman who was on duty the night before Elizabeth Short had been murdered, and she remembered seeing Elizabeth with 2 other people. However, she could not recall the other men's faces, but just Short's. In 2001, Steve contacted Stephen Kay, who was the district attorney's office in Los Angeles. Kay complimented Steve, and she would have charged Hodel with the murder if he were alive. The conclusion of the investigation made Steve think he had solved the case. Once Stephen Kay gave his approval, Steve was ready to begin the writing of his book about his story. His diligence influenced his son, Michael, who saw Steve working at 5 a.m. every morning. Steve kept this project a secret until January 2002, when he began telling his friends and family. He phoned Steve's father's widow, June Hodel, but she refused to acknowledge what Steve said. Steve then called his brother Kelly and didn't hold back, saying, "Our father was a homicidal maniac." When Steve finished his research, more surprising discoveries came up. The writer of the Los Angeles Times, Steve Lopez, received a copy of the book and took the time to investigate the story. During the investigation, he contacted the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for additional information on the murder. They opened for him a file that was left by Lieutenant Frank Jemison, one of the original officers on the Black Dahlia case, which was kept in the basement. The file was a mixture of various things, such as photos, newspaper clippings, and interview notes by Jemison that amounted to hundreds of pages. Among these notes was what Steve had hoped for. Throughout the investigation, the LAPD had 6 suspects in their sights, and George Hodel was one of them. In addition, there was a transcript from 1950, when the police were eavesdropping George Hodel's home. 3 years ago, it was freezing cold and Steve got up early on a January morning. He wanted to follow the same route he believed his dad drove the night Short was killed. It was, in fact, the day after Short's death anniversary. On several occasions, Steve displayed this drive to the journalists, friends, and relatives. Short's body was found in an area that was still expanding at that time. It was a nice neighborhood, and the houses are well maintained. The exact location of Short's body was a bit hard to figure out. I had to use a compass application and house numbers. Steve seemed to be relieved when we finally found it near a small house with nice grass close to the sidewalk. The dilemma is that Steve's thoughts turn his father into a hero. He suspects that the photographer, Man Ray, who was a friend of Short's father, could have been the one who killed him. Some of the pictures that Ray took look as if Short's body was in them. Steve understands that his dad was aiming to create a crime masterpiece as if it was a work of art that would be very well known. Steve's family thinks he's a man of purpose, but they don't understand him. Michael, Steve's son, does not understand why his father is still investigating. "For my dad, the Black Dahlia is his story," Michael added. "Anything that has importance in his life is probably from here. This has become his signature now." Steve is treating the case of the Black Dahlia like a never-ending puzzle. Each hint adds to the mystery. He thinks his father may be related to many murders in California. The tracks in LA lead him to the next destination in Chicago, then Manila, where he follows the case of Lucilla Lalu, who was killed in the same way as the Black Dahlia. The body of a young woman was found not far from the house of her father on the street called Zodiac. Steve believed it was a hint, but felt uneasy because people might think he's crazy for connecting his dad to the Zodiac murders. His first book about the Black Dahlia case got a lot of attention and praise, but when he claimed his father was also the Zodiac killer in his next book, interest dropped. Despite all his work, the police haven't taken him seriously. They're busy with other cases. Steve thinks they're hiding something. He's frustrated that big newspapers like the LA Times aren't covering his theory. Some people were impressed by his ideas, but felt he didn't prove them well. Most people have moved on from the Black Dahlia case. Even the closest relatives of the victim are gone. Steve has given up on convincing the police. He believes his readers are the ones who understand and believe him.